My name is Ujala Razak, and I'll be presenting the Guatemala and the elections image today. Just to give you an overview so that you'll be able to understand what actually was happening there, help you understand the presentation in a better way. I'll just give you an history of what was happening back in Guatemala. So I'll start with the statement how a sitting elected national government found itself in the position of having to buy a country. It all begins around the end of the Spanish American War in 1898. 3 years of fighting in the Cuban War of Independence eventually drew in the United States, which joined in the fighting against the Spanish Empire, with the imperial rival chased out of the region. American business piled into Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, leaving a leaf storm of political violence and instability in their wake. One of these business was, of course, the United States. Immediately following the Spanish-American War, the three largest American banana importers merged, like the American states before them, to form United Fruit. The resulting conglomerate did not rest on its laurels, but also used its monopoly, power, and scale to buy or muscle out competitors, including the Jamaican Banana Producer Associations, smallholders cooperatives. They pursued an aggressive vertical integration strategy aiming to own and control every aspect of banana production and distribution from tree to market. It required railroad and telegraph companies as subsidiaries, which it used to pitch itself as a credible partner for development and modernization, which helped it win land concessions through a subsidiary company. The United Fruit Company owned and controlled not just the banana business and the land the plantations were on, but much of the country's most important infrastructure: railways, hospitals, ports, and telegraph lines. Historian John Sullery reminds us that the many of the forest and grasslands targeted for export agriculture in the region were predominantly inhabited by the racially marginalized and outsiders, indigenous people, poor mestizos, and black maroons alongside Asian coolies. Displacing them by grabbing land in the name of modern economic progress was deemed not only permissible, but essentially philanthropic. These same groups showed up among the workers exploited by these companies. The Black West Indians and Black Garifuna banana workers, who were pivotal to the rise of the sectors in countries like Honduras and Costa Rica, all told United Fruit's strategy led to profitable partnerships with local businesses, elites, as well as military strongmen in the region, including infamously nasty characters like General Trujillo of the Dominican Republic and the House of Somoza in Nicaragua. But by the 1940s, powerful forces in Guatemala were done playing ball. A military junta in 1944 wrote up a liberal constitution that ended up censorship and banned racial discrimination. But the really dangerous thing that emboldened Guatemalan government attempted to be aimed to break the back of corporate ownership of its country. It decriminalized labor unions and built public infrastructure to compete with the private infrastructure built by the fruit company. Perhaps most dangerously of all, a 1952 agrarian reform law was poised to expropriate and redistribute 1.5 million acres of land to 100,000 Guatemalan families. It could have been worse. The government offered to pay the United Fruit Company for the land, precisely what the company had said the land was worth when calculating its value for taxation. But the company knew what was actually at stake: political control over the land and people of Guatemala. So it claimed that the land was actually worth a much larger figure than its own assessment. When the government refused to relent, the fruit company called US President Eisenhower for backup and they approved a clandestine operation to clarify who was in charge. The result overthrew the country's elected president, Jacobo Árbenz, and rolled back many of the reforms. The president of Guatemala was Arbenz, not Eisenhower, yet it was Eisenhower who teamed up with the United Fruit Company to exercise little judicial review on the 1952 Agrarian Reform Act. No serious investigation of who ruled in Guatemala could leave out these supposedly external forces. No matter what the 1944 Constitution named or didn't name as an official branch of government. So now I'll start with my presentation. Guatemala and the election image. I hope you might have gotten a bit of overview what we are going to talk about. Imagine you're watching Guatemala from far away. You see election posters, you see people voting, you see newspapers talking about democracy returning, you see foreign governments praising progress. From the outside, it looks like country is moving forward. But now imagine you're not watching from outside. Imagine you are living in a rural village. Soldiers are nearby. People have disappeared. Families are afraid to speak. The courts cannot protect you. The army decides what can and cannot be questioned. So the question becomes, how can both images exist at the same time? This is where manufacturing consent helps us understand Guatemala. Because consent is not always manufactured by forcing everyone to agree. Sometimes it is manufactured by controlling the story people are out to see. This presentation begins with an image, Guatemala as an election story. But the real story is not just about voting. It is about how elections can be used as a performance. In manufacturing consent, Chomsky and Herman argue that powerful institutions shape public opinions by deciding what gets attention, what gets ignored, and what words are used. So in Guatemala, the election became the main image, the violence became the background, and once the election was placed at the center, the world could say, look, democracy is returning. This is the central question of the whole presentation. Can democracy be born under army control? On paper, yes, there can be elections, there can be candidates, there can be speeches. But democracy is not only a ballot box. Democracy needs safety, courts, media, opposition, and the freedom to criticize power. If the army controls the boundaries of the politics, then the people are not choosing freely. They are choosing inside limits created by fear. Here we see how the image is manufactured. The public message is simple: Guatemala is becoming democratic again. But behind the image, the state still controls the courts, the oppositions, the press, and the limits of political debate. This is exactly how consent works. You do not have to completely hide reality, you only need to frame it correctly. Instead of saying the army still controls the country, you say Guatemala is transitioning to democracy. Instead of saying people are terrified, you say stability is returning. The same reality is given a softer language. Now, moving on to the other slide. So, the democratic decade and the threat of reform. To understand why this happened, we have to go back. Guatemala once had a real democratic opening. From 1945 to 1954, there were reforms, labor rights, and land redistribution. But this threatened powerful groups, landowners, as I already told you, military elites, and foreign business interests. This is where democracy becomes dangerous, not because people vote, but because people start asking for land, rights, wages, and dignity. So the problem was not that Guatemala had democracy. The problem was that democracy started touching real power. Moving on to the next slide. So the coup that reset Guatemala. It was orchestrated by CIA. So, yeah, it did not only remove a president, it sent a message. Reform has limits, democracy has limits. If democracy threatens elite interests, it can be destroyed. This is important for manufacturing consent because coups are rarely sold as coup against democracy. They are sold as protection, protection from communism, protection from chaos, protection from instability. So violence is presented as defense and repression is presented as order. This slide shows the structure beneath the image. There may be civilian courts, Congress, and presidents, but above them sits the military structure. That means the state keeps democratic clothing, but its body is still military. This is a key point. Manufactured consent does not always require removing institutions. Sometimes it keeps the institutions but empties them of the power. The court still exists, the Congress still exists, the election still exists. But the real question is who is actually in control? So, who was actually being controlled? The state claimed it was fighting communism, but who was really being controlled? Rural communities, indigenous communities, peasants, workers, students, human rights organizers. This is where propaganda becomes powerful. Once the state labels peoples as communists, subversives, or threats, violence against them become easier to justify. In manufacturing consent, this is the power of ideology. You create an enemy label, and then everything done against the enemy starts to look acceptable. So, a state that ruled through fear. The slide makes the hidden violence visible. This is important because elections after mass violence are not neutral events. If people have seen neighbors disappear, if villages have been attacked, if unions and students' groups have been crushed, then the election is not starting from freedom. The graph shows that the fear was not on this side of the political system, fear was part of the system. It is starting after terror has already shaped the choices. This is one of the strongest slides. Mass killing rebranded as stability. Counterinsurgency was rebranded as national security. Military control was rebranded as the path of democracy. This is exactly the kind of language manufacturing consent talk about. The reality is brutal, but the language is clean. Instead of massacres, they say security operation. Instead of repression, they say anti communist defense. Instead of military rule, they say transition. Instead of fear, they say order. The violence does not disappear, it is just renamed. Moving on to the next slide, control of the countryside. Here we see that control went deep into daily life. The countryside was not simply governed from above, it was reorganized. Villages, patrols, surveillance, forced participation, all of this turned ordinary life into a system of control. This is important because consent can be manufactured through pressure as well as media. People may appear to cooperate, but cooperation under fear is not true consent, it is survival. So the state could show organized communities and loyal citizens, but behind the image was coercion. The judiciary under the army. A real democracy needs courts that can challenge power. But if the judiciary military pressure, then justice becomes selective. This means the law still exists, but it cannot protect the people who need it most. That, that is another manufactured image. the appearance of legality. The question is, can those courts hold the army not a shield of performance? Shows that free speech is not just about whether speech is technically allowed. Free speech means you can speak without being destroyed. In Guatemala, people may have had formal political language, but the cost of speaking honestly was too high. This connects directly to manufacturing consent. If journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens are afraid, then the official story becomes louder, simply because other stories are silenced. Am I audible?
Yes, you
Hello?
are. I think there is a little bit of internet lagging. I don't know if it's for
Probably,
me
I
or
think.
for everyone. But you're audible. Go on.
All right, sure. Moving on to the next slide, the missing foundations of democracy. This slide gives the core argument. An election alone is not democracy. Democracy needs a living society around it. Unions, independent media, students, churches, human rights groups, opposition parties, and community organizations. But if those groups are crushed before election day, then the vote happens after society has been weakened. So the election becomes like a stage play. The curtains open, the actors appear, and the world claps. But the real script was written before the audience arrived. Who and what was allowed to compete? This slide is about controlled choice. People are allowed to choose, but only within limits. The deepest questions were not allowed to dominate: land reform, military crimes, indigenous rights, disappearance, accountability. This is a very important part of manufacturing consent. You do not always need to ban debate completely. You only need to decide which topics are realistic and which topics are too extreme. So the elections allowed politics, but not the kind of politics that could threaten the system. The mothers who asked where their loved ones were. Now the story becomes personal. Behind every political term, counterinsurgency, state violence, national security, there are families. Mothers asked a simple question: where are our children? This question cuts through propaganda. It's not ideological, it's human. And that is why it was dangerous, because once the disappeared are named, the official story begins to break. When grief becomes subversion. In a normal society, grief is allowed, but in Guatemala, grief became political. Asking about the disappeared became a threat. This tells us how fragile the manufactured image really was. If the state's story was true, why fear mothers? Why fear families? Why fear the names of the disappeared? Because the image of democracy depended on silence. The victims had to remain invisible for the election story to survive. The first step and the civilian facade. By 1984 and 1985, Guatemala represented itself as moving towards civilian rule. There was a constituent assembly, there was an election, there was a civilian president, and from the outside, this looked like a progress. But this slide asks us to look deeper. Who still had the guns? Who still had the intelligence networks? Who still controlled the countryside? Who still decided which truths could not be spoken? This is civilian facade, a civilian face placed over a military structure. And I think that doesn't seem like an unfamiliar thing. We have seen it and probably very closely. Formal power versus real power. This slide separates two things: official power and actual power. Officially, civilians governed. Actually, army, landowning elites, and civil patrols still held enormous influence. This is one of the strongest connections to manufacturing consent. The media and foreign governments can focus on formal power because it is easy to photograph a president, a ballot box, a ceremony. But real power is harder to photograph. It sits in the military commands, elite networks, threats, and invisible limits. So the manufactured image focuses on what can be shown and hides what actually controls the country. What the media framed versus minimized. This slide shows about what gets removed from the picture. The election image showed moderation, stability, and democratic progress. But what was cut out? Massacres, disappearances, civil patrols, model villages, rural fear, indigenous sufferings, the absence of land reform, the lack of justice. This is the most direct link to manufacturing consent. Reality is not always falsified, sometimes it's edited. The world is shown one frame and told it is the whole story. The election was real, the democracy claim was constructed. So the final argument is balanced. The election was real, people did vote, but the claim that this meant real democracy was constructed. That is the key lesson. Manufacturing consent does not mean inventing everything from nothing. It means taking one true part of reality, the election, and using it to hide the rest of reality. In Guatemala, the vote became proof of democracy, even though the foundations of democracy had been damaged by years of terror. So the story of Guatemala is not simply that democracy failed, it is that democracy was turned into an image, and that image was used because it allowed powerful actors to say the country is free now while many people were still living under fear. Thank you. Is there any question?
Thank you very much, Ojala. If there are any questions, please go on. Please fill in this feedback form, and inshallah, we will continue with chapter 3 of manufacturing consent in the next episode as well. Please take some time out to read the chapter to fully understand this presentation. If there are no questions, then we will wrap up the meeting. Iram, any suggestion or questions or anything?
Assalamu alaikum, Mehreen. I don't have any questions because I think this session was a bit information dense for me. So I couldn't really
Yeah,
keep up. And I hadn't read the chapter beforehand, but good effort.
yeah. This
I
is
can.
information dense, and we can't really keep up the pace if we haven't gone through the chapter ourselves.
What I understood basically was, oh, sorry, you have already explained everything, so I don't need to give my synopsis. But what I understood was that Nicaragua was basically, so to speak, U.S. enemy, and the other two states were the U.S. allies. So the way the political struggle and the politics in the three countries was presented to the public was very, very different. Am I correct? This was mainly the gist of the presentation.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's what.
somewhat.
Like,
Yeah,
well, I'm not going into the details, but this is my understanding from today's session.
which is pretty much close to whatever we tried to explain. Uh,
Um,
these presenters tried to explain. Yeah, very well done, mashallah. Salia and Sher Ali, do you want to share something? Okay, thank you very much, everyone. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Wa alaikum assalam.